that stand before us. And that is where we're at in Joshua chapter 3. Because in Joshua chapter 3, you have that concern and you have that question. We have the spies returning back to Joshua and giving their report. You might recall in the book of Numbers, that was a turning point for the first generation when the spies came back. That after their report, everything basically went sideways, and they would now wander in the wilderness for 40 years. The spies now come back for this second generation after being hidden in the house of Rahab, and now preparations are being made to go into the promised land. And chapter 3 begins with them beside the Jordan River. And God now comes and tells Joshua what they are going to be doing in crossing over the land. You'll notice in verse 3 it says to command the people, "As soon as you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. Yet there shall be a distance between you and it, about 2,000 cubits in length. Do not come near it, in order that you may know the way you shall go, for you have not passed this way before." And then Joshua said to the people, "Consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you." And Joshua said to the priests, "Take up the ark of the covenant and pass on before the people." So they took up the ark of the covenant and went before the people. Neat picture that is given here is God says, all right, we are now going to cross over. It is time finally to go into the promised land and enjoy all that God had said he would give to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and those even subsequent to them. And you'll notice that the command is very important, where basically Joshua tells the people by the mouth of God, what you are going to do is you are going to see the priests pick up the Ark of the Covenant. And what I want you to do is when you see that, you are going to follow the Ark of the Covenant. Because you don't lead God. You don't tell him which way to go. And you don't be the leader and say, well, I'm going to think we should go this way, God, or I think we're going to go that way. The big point that he starts off with is God is going to lead you into this land. You don't go first. You follow. And you'll notice that he says along the way, you're going to follow at quite a distance. You are going to stay 2,000 cubits away. That is 1,000 yards. That is over half a mile away from us. So don't visualize everybody just, getting up and walking right behind the Ark of the Covenant. Over half a mile a distance, as you would see the Ark of the Covenant begin to go and lead the people. And all of them would need to stay back. And so that they would understand God is in charge, God is in the lead, we are not setting the direction. And you also have, no doubt, along with that, a reminder about the extreme holiness of God. We have seen over and over again, you do not approach God. And it would make perfect sense to say, as the Ark of the Covenant is going to lead into the promised land, we are not going to just be walking right beside it and here we go. Huge distance kept. Because we are the ones who are supposed to follow God. And a similar vein that we've seen in the book of Exodus, as this Ark of the Covenant is about to pass before them and lead the way, the people need to prepare themselves in verse 5. Consecrate yourselves. Get ready for this moment. For God is your leader, and watch for the Ark of the Covenant to go. And that's really what the rest of chapter 3 is all about. Is this reenactment of the Exodus is occurring. For the second generation, they are now going to enjoy an Exodus on their behalf. God tells Joshua, I am going to exalt you before all the people. You don't have to worry about, is anybody going to believe you or believe your leadership or follow your direction? I'm going to exalt you before the people so that they will follow you and listen to you like they followed Moses and listened to Moses. And what is particularly interesting are the directions that God gives. You would expect directions that would be a whole lot easier, I suppose, than what this sounds like on the surface. Because in verse 8, what God says is that the priests are going to carry the Ark of the Covenant and they are going to walk into the Jordan River and stand there. And you kind of go, all right. Sounds different. That sounds challenging. And not only are you going to do that, what's going to happen is once you put your feet into the water, then the waters are going to stand up in one heap. And the phrase that one heap is the exact same wording in Exodus 15 when they sing a song about how the waters stood up in a heap in the first Exodus, also used in Psalm 78, which is describing an Exodus account there as well. This new generation is going to enjoy their own Exodus and see the mighty wonders of God as Joshua is going to be their leader and bring them into the promised land. But the text here wants us to recognize that this is a strong challenge of faith. You will notice in verse 15, it gives us this little parenthetical. And it says there in the middle of verse 15, it was the season when the Jordan overflows its banks throughout the harvest. Because we may have the tendency to go, well, the Jordan River, no big deal. I mean, if you measured it, it is not the Mississippi. It is not some monster, massive, half-mile wide Jordan River, drive your car across it, dividing states kind of river like we would think of, that you would be awed and impressed. In various times of year, the river can be fairly shallow and be fairly narrow in a lot of places. So on the surface to say, hey, we're going to cross the Jordan River may not have seemed like that big of a deal, except for the information that's provided here in chapter 3 and verse 15 and saying, it's a time of year right now when the Jordan is just overflowing its banks. I'm very excited that I was able to find a video, that this will hopefully work, that showed the Jordan River, what it looks like when it is in that flood stage season going on. We'll see if it'll do. Maybe. I had it work this morning for the 5 people who saw it while I was practicing this. Yeah, it sound and everything, that's right. It's there. But when I do that, it wants to get away from it. Anybody want to just walk on into that? You are going to be swept away. And here's the message. You're just going to take the Ark of the Covenant, put their feet in, and that's just going to stop. Just going to dry up right before their eyes. And so that's what is being pictured for us here in chapter 3 is, well, this challenge of faith before them. Are they going to step out in faith? Are they going to do what God has asked them to do? And beautifully you see in verse 14 of chapter 3, when the people set out from their tents to pass over the Jordan, with the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant before the people. And as soon as those bearing the Ark had come as far as the Jordan, the feet of the priests bearing the Ark were dipped into the brink of the water. And here's our parenthetical about the Jordan overflowing its banks. And during the time of the harvest, verse 16, the waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam and the city that is beside Zarethan. And those flowing down toward the Sea of Arabah, the salt sea, were completely cut off. And the people passed over opposite Jericho. And now the priest bearing the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. And all Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing through the Jordan. Really neat picture that's given there is as they walk into that water, just suddenly drying up. The locations here are of particular interest. We don't have exactly where these cities are, but some of them we do have. So that scholars are able to calculate that at minimum, the distance of dry ground would have been at least 16 miles. And so you have 16 miles of dry ground, which would make sense because we need to cross over millions of people that have to stay half a mile away from the Ark of the Covenant that is in the middle of the Jordan River. And so a huge drying up happens before them all so that they can all cross over into this Jordan. And again, God showing He is able to do what people cannot do. And He is able to do the impossible. And this is going to strike fear into the hearts of the nations and the peoples on the other side of the Jordan, hearing how this has happened as they cross through the Jordan in the season of the harvest of the flooding of that river. Here they come and march their way in. In the process of doing that, in chapter 4, the Exodus continues to be reenacted. And what we see there is this is going to now be a memorial moment for Israel. That Joshua and the people are told where the Ark of the Covenant and those priests stood in the middle of the Jordan, that they are going to take up stones from that land and put it at the end of the Jordan River where they cross into the Canaan land. And it will stand there and it will be a monument and a reminder to the people of what God has done. And the purpose of that monument will sound very familiar to the things that we have seen in the book of Exodus, because this monument of stones is going to be there. And in chapter 4, verse 6, he says, what's going to happen is your children are going to ask what these stones mean. Which you might remember in the Exodus account, the whole Passover sequence, the children are going to ask, what does this all mean? This is a new Exodus event that is happening for the second generation. We are also told in chapter 4, verse 10, the people are going to pass through in haste. And you remember the Passover time when the Exodus, where Egypt expels them from the land, that they are going to leave in haste with their unleavened bread, and they were to have the sandals on their feet and the staff in their hand ready to go as they would hastily leave from the land of Egypt. They are then told in chapter 4 and verse 14 that one of the reasons God did this was so that the people would stand in awe of Joshua like they did of Moses. In chapter 4 and verse 18, you will notice that as soon as the Ark of the Covenant leaves then the Jordan River, it says that the waters returned to their place and overflowed all of its banks as before. Just imagine that video of just the rushing of all of that returning right back into the very place where it was. You saw that in the Exodus account. Once all of Israel crossed, then the waters then return and wipe out all of the Egyptians. So again, mirroring the Exodus. In fact, even of greater interest, as you will notice in verse 19, the wording, and the people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal, the eastern border of Jericho. They come up out of the waters on the very day of the Passover itself. First month, 10th day. And so all of the Exodus events and the Passover events are all strongly tied to the event that's happening here before their eyes, to give them something that they will remember, that this would be monumental and that they would never forget. It is so interesting that God recognizes this, how often God gives memorials. He gives these reminders and calls for His people to never forget. And one of the reasons why is because forgetting God and forgetting what God has done is our greatest danger and our greatest threat to faith. This is what happens is we forget what God has done. And when we forget all that God has done, we lose faith. We choose not to obey anymore. God now is taken for granted. We forget what He's accomplished for us. We forget the mighty wonders. We forget all of the great works that He's done because we just go on into the day-to-day things. That is easy for us to see. Just think of any national memorial that we have. And just think about how time erases the intensity of the memorial, year by year by year. It comes to a point, a great example would be Pearl Harbor Day. What do we do about that? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's a day that rolls by and the news goes, hey, it's Pearl Harbor Day, and they show us some grainy black and white stuff, and we all go, yeah, that happened. And we go off to work. That's our problem, is we need constant reminders. And God recognized that. And that's why God gave us some memorials, why He gave us baptism, why He gave us these kinds of things like the Lord's Supper, that we have these symbols before us that would always tie us in to remind us of what God has done. The Lord's Supper is critical as a reminder for us. We need that as constantly before our eyes and before our minds of what God did for us through Christ. And this is what God is always saying, I don't want you to forget, because forgetfulness is the great enemy of faith. I would also submit to you that it is important for us to consider our own personal stones of remembrance as well. That we would always think about the times when God has helped us and rescued us. That we have not only in a global span what God has done for the world and the salvation of the world and how we've been rescued from our sins, but please think about how many times you have faced life where you were in a dark place and didn't know what the future held, how hard that circumstance was. And then God gets you through that circumstance. And in the same way, over time, what happens? We forget how God carried us through. We forget the intensity of how hard it was at that time, how our faith was greatly tested, how we didn't know how we were going to make it. And then some way God works out something and we come through the other side, and time can cause us to forget that. One of the reasons God gives us these memorials is so that we are able to deal with the future obstacles based on what God has done for us in the past. And that is the argument that he makes here in chapter 3 and as well as in chapter 4, is so that this event would be so that they would know with certainty that God was giving them the land. If God is going to dry up the Jordan River, then do you need to worry about Jericho or Ai or any of the cities that lie ahead? Absolutely not. It wasn't only, hey, don't forget the great things God has done, but don't forget the great things God has done so that you are ready for the next obstacle that comes. So when you come up to Jericho, you won't be nervous about that or whatever that obstacle may be. And that's what God is declaring as to why he is doing this for the people and why he is exalting Moses and why this great scene of the Levites and the priests as they go in with the Ark of the Covenant and bring this about is so that they will understand and so that they will know that God has the power over all of this and that there is nothing for them to fear. Notice chapter 4, verse 23. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, and that you may fear the Lord your God forever. This was supposed to be a pivotal moment. When God brings in this deliverance, it was supposed to change everything about what they were supposed to know in regards to God, and it was to bring God glory throughout all the earth. Now, as we come into chapter 5, you might think that we have left the theme of what these 3 chapters are looking at about stepping in faith and being able to trust God to walk out in faith. But chapter 5 shows that we are very much still in that frame. Please consider this moment now. You now have, according to chapter 5, and you'd imagine as we come into Jericho, you're going to see as well, the peoples are terrified about these Israelites. They are terrified about what God is going to do. Rahab confessed that to the spies in chapter 2. And now we have this great reenactment of the Exodus with the drying up of the Jordan River. And now you have crossed all the people over to the other side. And would it not be the right time to attack? Would it not be the right time? Let's go up and get them while they're quivering, while they're shaking in their boots. Let's go on the offensive and let's deal with these cities. Chapter 5 is very interesting because what God tells the people to do in verse 2 is they tell all the men to be circumcised. That is not a good battle plan. That is not how you prepare for battle. If you recall Genesis 34, that leaves you completely defenseless. Remember the whole scene with Dinah and Shechem and the whole trick that's played on them. You used to get all the men circumcised and it just leaves them unable to fight. It would seem that the last thing you would want to do is cross into enemy territory and plop down there at Gilgal in Canaanite land and now circumcise all of the men. You're a sitting duck if they attack. And you are certainly not able to attack. I did a little homework. It takes up to 3 weeks for an adult male to recover from that. And in fact, it says that they waited for them to heal in regards to that as well before they would move on. I want you to notice the reasoning that's described here. Look at verse 4 of chapter 5. And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the males of the people who came out of Egypt, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness on their way after they'd come out of Egypt. Though all the people who came out had been circumcised, yet all the people who were born on the way in the wilderness after they had come out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the people of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not obey the voice of the Lord. The Lord swore to them that he would not let them see the land that the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So it was their children whom he raised up in their place that Joshua circumcised. For they were uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. Verse 8, when the circumcising of the whole nation was finished, they remained in their places in camp until they were healed. And the Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. And so the name of that place is called Gilgal to this day. Notice the reasoning behind this is that this new generation has not experienced that. Oh, why is circumcision so important? Because it was a sign of the covenant. This is a covenantal picture. And I want you to notice how covenantal it is. The way God describes it in verse 9 when he says, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt. That this moment, this new Exodus, this crossing through the river, crossing through the waters, and coming to the other side, and then enjoying this sign of circumcision, were all pictures then of the new beginning now. This was really finally turning the page from the old chapter of what had happened in Egypt and what had happened in the wilderness and how they had disobeyed. It is a new generation. It is a new beginning. It is a clean break from the past. And I think one of the great pictures is inevitably to say that the reproach of Egypt has been rolled away from you, is that the stain of slavery was gone. You're no longer slaves. This is the new generation. They are free as the people of God. And they are enjoying that. And of all the things, verses 10 through 12 show us as a reminder, it's the Passover. That's what the Passover was all about, is here is God rescuing the people, a clean break from the past, cleaning them up and making them ready to be God's people. I just find it fascinating that according to our calendar, if you will, God has 365 days he could have brought Israel into the land of Canaan. And he waits until the Passover to put them through the waters, to part the Jordan River, to enjoy all of the Passover events, to land on the other side, to put up the memorial stones of what God has done, and then enjoy a Passover feast there as they sit there healing from circumcision, which was a picture of how God had cut the past away and brought them into this new covenantal relationship with God. And here they sit then on the brink of the promised land. Let's talk about 3 applications for tonight, and we'll pick up the rest of this next week. Number one, I think one of the just amazing pictures that is truly given to us is that we have been given a call to step out in faith if we're going to cross into the promised land. There is always this requirement to enjoy the promised land. You are going to have to step out in faith. That has been heavy for 40 years. Let's make it 80 years. If you remember, Moses first is trying to deliver the people, and they have nothing to do with him. Moses goes and is a shepherd for a while. He comes back again, and little do we know until later on, when he came back to be their deliverer as God had told him to, the people still did not believe him and still did not want to follow him. Because their first complaint when they now move out into the wilderness is, you should have left us in Egypt like we told you to leave us back there. There wasn't faith to step out. When they get backed up to the Red Sea, there's panic. There's not faith in God. When they cross over and they're in the wilderness, there is not faith when it comes to the water, it comes to the food. When it comes to conquering the land, there is not faith believing that God is going to give them victory. And so they must wander in the wilderness now for 40 years until all of the aged over 20 are going to die. I think it's so interesting that over and over again, God puts forward the challenge that if you are going to enter into the promised land, you must step out in faith. And I would like for us to consider this question, just to challenge us. How is it possible for us to see the faithfulness of God if we don't attempt to trust in his faithfulness? I mean, imagine if all of the priests who have the Ark of the Covenant just went, you know what, that is a roaring river. We're not going to put our feet in there. Nobody's going to see what God was about to do. Imagine if nobody's going to trust in God and say, let's go ahead and leave Egypt. You're not going to see the great works of what God is able to accomplish. So much of us, of our lives, can be so stuck on walking by sight and not by faith. And God over and over again is challenging us to step out in faith. Will you believe in what I can do? Will you truly trust me or not? When you come into the New Testament, you see a similar picture where Peter is willing to ask Jesus, if that's you, command me to come out on the water. And Jesus goes, all right, come on. Would you have ever seen that moment without the faith to say, Lord, if you ask me to come out here, it can happen? There must be our willingness to trust in God's faithfulness if we are going to see the faithfulness of God. If we are always trusting in ourselves, it's not possible for us to see the faithfulness of God. If we were Israel leaving Egypt, we'd say, no, my GPS says we shouldn't go this way. That's going to back us up against the water. We need to go another way. And you're not going to see the great works of God. If the Levite or the priest say, no, this is a really bad idea, we need to go up and over the Sea of Galilee to enter Canaan, then that would be the right way to go. That's what we want to do with God so often. We know what's best. We know the direction. And here is God laying out this picture. The Ark of the Covenant, representing the very presence of God, is going to go before you. And I want you to keep over half a mile back, and you just watch where I'm going, and you follow. You just follow. And we sing songs like that. Where he leads, I'll follow. And the chorus should say, as long as we agree with the direction. Right? So often we jump in and go, well, I'll go if I understand the reason why. If it makes sense to me. If it works to my understanding. But how often what God does to challenge faith defies understanding. It doesn't make any sense for some priests to carry a box that has poles in it into a raging Jordan River. That makes no sense at all. And it doesn't make any sense to circumcise your army and all of the men before going into battle in enemy ground. But do you trust God that his way is right and best, even if it doesn't make sense to us? This is what our prayer life just needs to be full of. That we are dependent upon God. That we would express to God, Lord, I don't know anything. I don't know which way to go, and I have nothing. And Lord, you know. You know the way, and you know what's best. We sit here with such limited vision. God knows how all of this is playing and how all of it's working together in everything that he is accomplishing. But do we trust God in that process? Do we believe in what he's trying to do? Can we say, like the Apostle Paul, we walk by faith and not by sight? Is what James reminds us, that if we ask God doubting, why would we expect anything? And in that context, he's talking even about wisdom. If you don't even think God will give you wisdom, then asking of such a prayer, you're not going to receive anything from God. How easy it is to come before God full of doubts. I don't know if you're going to do this, God. I don't know if you really care. To be able to see the faithfulness of God requires us to trust in the faithfulness of God. That's what Israel does here. Number two, the reason why we can step out in faith is because we have experienced an even greater exodus. We've experienced a far greater exodus than what happened with the first generation and they crossed the Red Sea, and the second generation when they crossed the Jordan River. It is not an accident that God uses these pictures again and again. If you remember, as Paul writes to the Corinthian Christians and says, you've also passed through the cloud and passed through the sea. You've experienced your own exodus in Christ. You are enjoying all the same benefits, even more so, because in the first Exodus in the Red Sea and the second one through the Jordan River were all pictures of what Christ was going to do for the whole world in rescuing everybody. A grand new Exodus was going to occur. And friends, our baptism is an emblem, that reminder, that memorial, that symbol of how we have had the exodus from the slavery to sin as well, that we have had the reproach of Egypt rolled away from us. It pictures us crossing over from death to life. That's what Romans chapter 6 describes. It describes it as the circumcision. The same idea of what just happened here is this whole picture of the stain of the slavery of sin has been removed. We get a clean break, a new start, a new beginning. This is our exodus. And what we have seen is the greatest mighty work that God has ever accomplished. Raising Jesus from the dead. The greatest exodus moment. The greatest picture. And it is our greatest hope. We are able to step out in faith because we have seen the mighty wonders of God. The resurrection is everything. It is the hope that we have. It's the basis for faith It's Paul's whole chapter in 1 Corinthians 15 that the resurrection is everything we stand on. If Jesus truly raised from the dead, then what do we have to worry about or question in regards to faith? We know what God can do, and we've seen it in Jesus himself. Amen. Number 3, we are able to step out in faith when we remember what God has done for us. It is so important that we never forget what God has done for us. And I would ask you, not only in terms of the memorials that we do each week, that would be important to us, and that the Lord's Supper would have that value, that remembrance of our clean break from sin, from slavery. How it would represent to us this new life that we have. It would represent to us the new Exodus that we have experienced through Jesus Christ. And not only the Lord's Supper, but that your baptism would be that picture to us as to you and to me as well. That baptism represents the clean break and the new life and the circumcision that brings us into covenant relationship with God. But I would encourage you to think about what reminders can you give yourself to remember how God has helped you in times past. It is so easy to forget how difficult things were before. That God can so radically change your life that you just forget all of those dark days and dark times. And you forget how bad it was. No, I mean, you remember it. But you can easily forget how helpless and hopeless you felt at that time. If I had more time, I'd share a little bit more, but I will say, for my own life, I can look at it and just see how God has radically changed so many things in my life. And I look at a broken family, a person looking to escape, try to figure out a whole new thing all by myself, and how God has brought me this amazing family that I have, this amazing congregation that I have, how God has helped us through financial loss, 2 college kids having both their cars completely destroyed by a hailstorm in Kentucky, and left with nothing, and going, oh great, what are we going to do about this? How God has helped us with a child with special needs, given us 14 years of that, and continues to teach us patience and hope through all of that. And just go on and on and on. And it's so easy to forget the challenges and trials and pains of yesterday, and forget that God got you through all of those things. What impossible obstacles has God dried up before your very eyes? What difficulties has He helped you pass by? What events in your life looked so impossible to cross? God dried up those waters and brought you through to the next day. I encourage you to give thanks to God, and that we never forget that. Let's pray at this time. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for how you constantly work in our lives in ways that we just don't even see or understand. We thank you for the cross and for the resurrection of Jesus, and how that just changes everything for our hope. It gives us faith to trust you. I pray that we'd have a greater faith to believe in your promises, and to not see the physical, look to ourselves, but to always look to you. To look to you for how you can get us through each day, how you've carried us through in the past, to believe that you will carry us through again and again and again. I pray that we will trust in your faithfulness. And I pray that we'll have a greater courage to have greater faith in you in the days ahead. Lord, thank you for helping us through our lives. Thank you for helping us in ways that we probably cannot even begin to comprehend. But we know you are with us, that you've promised to never leave us or forsake us, and that you'll give us the strength we need to handle whatever obstacle lies ahead. Thank you for your great promises in Jesus' name.
Amen.
We'll sing an invitation song. We invite you to come to Jesus. We invite you to see that he is our great leader who has accomplished a great exodus so that we can be set free. And we can enter into the promised land and enjoy eternal life with God. Are you ready to come and do that? We encourage you to think about what you can do to serve your God, and we want to help you do that. Won't you come while we stand in the Lord?